branch of the Celtic fraternity and established themselves as the Anglo-Saxon ruling elite. Another argument is that the Celtic population mixed and commingled with these Germanic invaders. But the point is that neither term, be it Celtic or Anglo-Saxon, is monoethnic. Neither of these terms describe a skin color. None of these terms describe a hair color. None of these terms describe an eye color. Good, let's move on. So from the 11th century to the 15th century, an Anglo-Norman hegemony was established. This Anglo-Norman hegemony was predicated on the basis of being able to draw your aristocratic blood from William the Conqueror. It later became your capacity to draw your blood from the Plantagenet line, either Henry II or Edward I, depending on how forward you're going in history. It was never based on skin color or hair texture. So England didn't develop a racialized perspective, a kind of racialized perspective that is now present, either as an undercurrent or an overt current, within modern English thought, did not develop in the medieval period. Nor would I suggest, did it develop in the early part of the early modern period. That is firmly a feature of the end of the period of time in which we're talking about and the beginning of the modern age, despite the fact of people wishing to blame medieval England or early modern England for all of modern day racism. Unfortunately, so much of modern racism is in fact down to us and the science of race, biological determinism, John Frederick Blumenbach, Carl Linnaeus. These are 18th, 19th century writers, perhaps Francis Bernier at the end of the 17th century. It's not William the Conqueror. It's not Henry II. It's not Edward I. It's not Edward III. It's not Henry VI. It's not Henry VII. And it's not even Queen Elizabeth or Henry VIII. It's actually us, the modern people. So, within the period of time that we're talking about, people of African descent, people of color, were part of medieval and early modern English society. And these people were called Moors, Garamantes, Barbaries. Later, but from the influence of the Spanish, they were called Negroes, or nigar, from the Latin word black. But these terms are later terms. The early terms, such as Saracen, which was a generic term, a term capable of describing lots of people, including Africans. An example, Bartholomew in 13th century Nottingham is on the run. He has escaped from his employer, Roger de Linton, and he is on the run. He has broken his bond, which meant that in this case, this particular person may have been enslaved at some point, or may indeed be a slave nominally at some point. And he's on the run in Nottingham in the 13th century. Bartholomew is described and called a Saracen in the pipe rolls in which he appears. And he is also described as a blackamoor. He's described as a blackamoor twice and a Saracen once. The term Saracen here is a generic term to describe the fact that in this case, Bartholomew is probably not a Christian. So this term Saracen is capable of describing, in this case, a blackamoor, but also other people from Asia Minor and other places too. So, when we see references in English records, we should not dismiss the term Saracen as only applying to Salahuddin or people from Asia Minor, since the term was capable of describing Africans as well, as it did with Bartholomew, on the run in 13th century England. This term Saracen also described people of African descent, such as the man buried in Ipswich, in the Greyfriars Cemetery, also in the 13th century. This African man, that considerable research has been done on his DNA, etc., probably hailed either from North Africa or the Iberian Peninsula. These are places that from the 7th century all the way through to the 16th century had a significant presence of people of color from North and West Africa and Asia Minor. Some of these people were colloquially called Moors and also colloquially called Saracens. The man buried in the Ipswich Cemetery, whose bones we have now dug up and investigated, hailed from one of these regions and was probably employed in the Greyfriars Cemetery in which he was buried. Other people of African descent present in England include those described by Richard Devizes in his text satirically. Richard Devizes goes further than the few records that we have definitely, categorically said these people of African descent. He goes further. Richard Devizes actually says it with a satirical note that the people of African descent make up a significant presence of the people of other nations present inside the capital of the City of London. And he also satirically says that if you're a traveller coming to England, pass through London quickly, because it's full of tribes of all nations, including the Gadamantes, including the people of African descent, the people of Moorish descent. Now, this is not entirely surprising that we should find not only records of people of African descent during the medieval period, but that we also should find images of people of African descent present in England and in other parts of Europe. This is because from the 8th century, Gibral al-Tariq, that the Rock of Gibraltar is named after, arrived in 711 on the Iberian shore with an army of people, predominantly of whom were of North and West African ancestry. Only a minority were actually from Asia Minor. Gibral al-Tariq began a series of incursions, followed up by other people from North, West Africa, and from Asia Minor. These incursions pushed all the way up through the Iberian Peninsula. At one point, during the early part of the 8th or 9th century, the Moorish population had 90% of Spain and Portugal under their authority. Also in the 8th century, these Moorish sets of peoples invaded what is modern-day France, settled down in Picardy, settled down in the Aquitaine, reached as far as Le Mans, settled in parts of Normandy. A reconquista, beginning in the 8th century, sought to drive out these Moorish populations, and we know that much of this reconquista has now been glamorized in mythology. We read about it in the Song of Roland, which is unequivocal, absolutely unequivocal in describing the Moorish people who had invaded France as being people of African descent. Unequivocal. I know we may smart at it with a kind of political correctness and argue with our politically correct, woke 21st century minds about the way in which these people are described. But I say actually thank goodness that these terms are so explicit, because it helps to disrupt the emotional narrative that we might have in describing the Moorish people as not being capable of being people of African descent. So the mythology of the Song of Roland, the mythology of the matter of France, is quite clear that the Moorish population are dark-skinned people, or at least the dark-skinned people of African descent make up a significant part of the Moorish population. Here shown in this 8th century image. These people are also depicted in other images that crisscross around Europe and describe these Moorish people as warriors, warlords, servants, friends, and neighbors. We mustn't think that the conflicts of the Moorish population led to a racialized perspective being developed in all parts of Europe. Certainly in some parts of Europe, even as early as the 8th or 9th century, there is an ethnic chauvinism and an anti-blackness that is present in some of those pieces of work written about those Moorish people. But this anti-blackness and anti-Africanness is not predicated on the same kinds of ideas that anti-blackness and anti-Africanness and modern-day racism is predicated. And we should stop saying that it was, because it's not predicated on the same ideas. It's predicated on the basis of these people being conquerors, warriors, and warlords in Europe, not on the basis of them being automatically enslaved, inferior, etc.